Excellent. My name is Tom Taylor. I'm the director of the Andover Public Library, representing public libraries. I'll have my other two committee members introduce themselves.
This is Steve Waugh. I am a member of the advisory board of the State Library. I represent the general public and I live here in Topeka.
Hello, Rhoda McLaughlin Ramirez with Cali College, representing 2-year colleges.
Okay, I'd also like to acknowledge State Librarian Ray Walling and State Library of Kansas Advisory Board Chair Randy Roberts of Pittsburgh State University. And I see Charles Mashiers that just joined us. Welcome, Charles. Charles is the counsel for the State Library. Next, we're looking at approving the agenda for this meeting. Steve and Rhoda, have you had a chance to examine the agenda?
I'll motion to approve the agenda.
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Agenda is approved. Next line of business is the approval of the June 21st minutes.
I'll also move to approve the June 21st minutes.
I'll second.
Okay, minutes have been approved. On our next agenda item, it is discussion of our report to the rest of the board and to the state librarian. And Ray asked that these items be reminded of us because we are here to provide concerns and recommendations, the three of us, to the state library staff and to the state library advisory board. We're not here to deal with implementation or do any wordsmithing, writing the words. We leave those to the other individuals. And then the State Library of Kansas staff will suggest implementation of any changes to the board as a whole. On subpoint B of number 5, the discussion was, it was the state librarian was asking us to look at changes and how they would apply to all systems, not just Central Kansas Library System. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge that I received, Ray and I received an email from Richard Richard Brookman, director of the Southwest Kansas Library System, expressing concerns about applying changes or implementing changes to all of the regional library systems. I'll just summarize a few things. Well, first off, it's really outside of our committee. We're here to look at Central Kansas Library System in Hayes. I think what our recommendations are could be very well considered for the rest of the regional library systems. The discussion by that Richard had and their concerns is that each of the regional library systems are different. They are designed to meet the needs of the residents in the counties that they represent or that they receive taxing from. As some of the systems have memberships for academic libraries and private libraries, some of them do not. As such, their executive boards are different. And I think we need to take that into consideration. Secondly, that Richard suggested that this might not even be something looking at uniformity of the composition of the executive boards and things might not actually be under our auspices as a state library advisory board. Actually, there is a clause in there that is, but I think Ray and Charles, we probably need some clarification on the what is the role of the state library in regard to governance of the regional library systems. Thank you for that. Let's get into our discussion.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah.
Tom, this is Steve.
Hi.
I just wanted to react. I really appreciated Richard's letter and how he brought these subjects up and kind of represented many, if not all, of the rest of the systems librarians. I think they were good points and that we have to be considerate of.
Thank you, Steve. I agree. So our committee has two things that we're looking at. One is we've been tasked to look at the memorandum of a proposed memorandum of understanding between the State Library Advisory Board and the Central Kansas Library System. And secondly, we've been tasked to look at system governance of the Central Kansas Library System. So the first is the structure of the Central Kansas Library System plan allotments. We've seen that structure, the proposed structure, and that was kind of the impetus for tabling the Central Kansas Library System plan was their original proposed plan, which ceased payments to Salina Public Library and Hayes Public Library for their processing. Does anyone have any points or concerns about the structure of their plan allotments? We can get into their specifics in our next point. And I'm going to say that, Ray, I really appreciated your amendment. I think that was under a short amount of time, you really sort of came up with a compromise that I think was good for everyone. Now, of course, people aren't going to be entirely satisfied, but I think in terms of getting a 2024 plan and budget approved for the Central Kansas Library System, I really do appreciate that amendment, and I think that gets us through this year. That takes us to B, elimination of the processing grant. Now, in the amendment, Ray, the amendment that was approved by the processing grant is no longer called necessarily the processing grant. It's not funded by an MOU. In their annual plan, Central Kansas Library System suggested that, or not suggested, they want to eliminate funding from MOUs. There were a lot of MOUs. Some of them weren't even very well codified years ago. And so their goal is to try to eliminate that and have more structure to their grants and aid and services. Also, they have a statement in their system plan that they want it to be available for everyone, services that they offer to be available for everyone. Central Kansas Library System indicated that they would support Salina and Hayes getting processing from Central Kansas Library System if they were to do so. I think for me, the concern is the logistics of that. Frankly, Hayes and Salina purchase far more materials than the rest of the libraries. I mean, Great Bend might be comparable to Hayes, I don't know, but they use different vendors and they have different needs. I understand the desire to make services available to everyone and not have specific funding, but I think someone needs to explore what is it possible to take that money and have Ingram do Hayes and Salina. They might reject it, but is that something that even could be done? Secondly, I would recommend that it be explored as to the nature of the processing. Our library gets a lot of pre-processing done from our vendor. We use Baker and Taylor. They put the barcodes on, they cover the they provide covers for the hardbacks, they laminate the paperbacks. They do a lot of the processing in advance of us getting the material. Now, our library still has to do stuff like stamping and among other things. But I guess I'm curious as to what processing actually is done in Great Bend. I understand that some of the small rural libraries don't have a lot of time, and to ask them to do some of the processing might be difficult. But it's possible that instead of having everything, it might be possible that instead of having everything go to Great Bend, have the pre-processing done off-site by the vendor and then materials shipped directly to the libraries. That's something that could be done, and then that you could apply that to everyone. I don't know. I know why the Central Kansas did processing centrally in the past. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the best option for them, but that's not for me to decide. Not at all. But that's one thing I think that would need to be clarified is, could the Central Kansas Library System handle the processing needs of Great Bend and Hayes? And I think that's a tall order. Secondly, is there another way of doing the processing without eliminating funding to the two largest libraries in their system? One thing, in looking at their plan, their governance did vote for it, and we're going to get into governance here shortly. Actually, I'll just save that. So the Central Kansas Library System has asked for a memorandum of understanding between the State Library Advisory Board about phasing out of this, we're going to call it processing grant, to Salina and Hayes, this allotment. And that was something that was, I think, a lot of the reason why we voted as a board to table their plan was there was no phased withdrawal. It was just boom, it's gone. And so that was, one thing that the board wanted to consider was phasing it out. So that was the proposal. The letter from the attorney for the Hayes Public Library Board suggests, and I think probably rightfully so, that our role as a state library advisory board is to approve an annual plan, not approve long-range planning. And so a memorandum of understanding might be not advisable for our board to do. And that's probably something that we would need to have Charles and Ray look at is, should we even be doing an MOU? Or could we even do an MOU? Boards change, library directors change. I mean, our board won't be the same in June as it is right now, most likely. That's my concern about a phasing them out, and the MOU is it even something that we can or should do? That's one of my concerns. I'll let you other two talk for a while if you want.
Tom, I don't have anything to add. I think you summed it up pretty well.
How about you, Rhoda?
No, I'll agree. A lot of unknowns and concerns. The only other consideration I had when it came to processing is we're much smaller and we process all of our things here, but we also buy a lot of our processing supplies in advance. So all of that would have to be weighed too with supplies on hand, et cetera. So there wasn't loss of funds that way either, but.
Yeah, good points, both of you. I think that our committee would then advise against a memorandum of understanding between the whole state library board and Central Kansas Library System. That's our recommendation based on the three of us. That covers 6A and B. Now let's look at governance. System governance for the Central Kansas Library System, headquartered in Great Bend. And then this is something that we've had documents for some time going back and forth between representatives of both Hayes and Central Kansas Library System. So we need to, and part of one of our original charges was to look at the system governance of Central Kansas Library System. First off, I think the election of the executive board for the Central Kansas Library System. So looking at it from a standpoint of is this appropriate? Is it equitable? I do have a comment. The board, has representation of libraries based on size category. And they modeled that after some of the other regional library systems. And I think that's an excellent way of having representation in your system. Executive board is to have a representative representing the different sizes of libraries. Hayes and Great Bend are considerably different from Osborne and Sylvan Grove. Now, one thing that I noticed in the various communications is Brandon Hines, Mr. Brandon Hines, the director of the Hayes Public Library, was running for a position. He was the only candidate running for his size group of libraries, but he did not receive a majority of the vote, and therefore they did not give him a seat on that board. I was surprised by this, frankly. Based on my experiences with the South Central Kansas Library System, I was surprised that they were rejected a seat based on the other libraries not voting in favor of appointing Mr. Hines. Seems like if there's only one library in that size, or maybe perhaps maybe Great Bend and Hayes are in the same category. I think that's likely anyway, at least by the state standards. So I thought that seems problematic to me.
Tom, but hasn't that been changed now? I'm unclear about that.
I don't believe it has, but someone else could perhaps chime in, and maybe I'm misreading it.
I believe CKLS adopted a change to their bylaws recently to make it clear how elections happen that would allow for that. I think it was unclear in the previous bylaws that was permissible, but that was the way they went. Does that make sense?
So their change doesn't allow for, their change allows for if there's one candidate, that candidate will be seated regardless of whether they have a majority of the vote.
I believe so.
Okay.
If you wanted to ask CKLS a question specifically of that we have representatives from there today to clarify, but
yeah, let's do that real quick. I see you're there, Gail. Are we understanding the bylaws change right?
A little bit off base. The first thing is that the first time Brandon ran, he wasn't running for a library size position. He was running for an open position. At CKLS, you've always had to be approved by a majority vote. And that we clarified that in the bylaws. So anyone who is running, no matter how many people are running for position, they need to state the position they're running for, and then they need to win by a majority vote. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Gail. Okay.
I'll just clarify, when did that change occur?
May. It was voted on by a
So it's accurate to say it's recently then.
Yes, a 2/3 vote by the full system board, yes. And that was crafted with the help of the parliamentarian, the professionally registered parliamentarian.
Okay, I really appreciate that information, Gail. I guess the concern that I have is the way everything is structured. And there's no way around it, I suppose, but the smaller libraries could simply, vote to decrease funding for the larger ones based on the clear majority of membership. And I get it, that's the way it's structured. But I think that's part of the original concern, is that one of the things that the attorneys for Hayes have claimed is that large number of out-of-district borrowers use the Hayes Public Library, much larger than, the proportions of the smaller libraries. And that has been considered in the funding, in one of the grants. But the contention that comes from Hayes is that, they're not being fully compensated for their service to a large amount of residents outside of the city limits, residents that pay into the system tax. So I'm a little concerned about the ability of, small public libraries to dictate changes. And I don't know if there's any way around it. I mean, given the structure, but I certainly can understand and sympathize with Hayes and Salina when they are concerned about these things.
So Tom, this is Steve. I guess I don't know where that leaves us as related to this point on the agenda.
Yeah, we're sort of looking at election of the executive board and composition of the board. So little I and I2. Those are just some of the concerns on those two. I think they're kind of similar. And Gail did provide some clarification about which board. Subcommittees is another thing that we were to look at is appointment of subcommittees. And did either of you have any concerns about that? All right, item 4, not providing virtual options to attend system meetings at all levels. I spoke with Gail on the phone and talking about virtual attendance isn't always possible for some of the small libraries. Some of them do not have high-speed broadband. They're still in dial-up. But there is an option that exists, Gail assured me, for everyone, and that is to phone in. So as long as there is an option, whether it's telephone or internet, I'm not concerned as long as there is that option. And in the email from Richard, he talked about how their system has a different, the Southwest Kansas Library System, how they're encouraging in-person attendance and how they're viewing it differently. And I think that's an example of a regional library system tailoring their governance and their services to their specific constituents. But I think that a phone option would suffice. It's not virtual, but it's a remote option.
I think that is just fine. I agree with you, Tom. The phone system, the telephone option, while it's not as maybe warm and fuzzy as a video option or in person, it certainly works. I lived my life doing that, all over the world. It works if you prepare properly.
And I'm going to chime in briefly too and say, yes, with the preparation properly, which means all of the documents and shared visuals and all of that ahead of time. I understand the phone option for those that don't have high-speed internet, but I think if at all possible, the virtual should be provided for the others that do. We are such a small staff here that without the virtual option, I wouldn't be able to attend the majority of things.
Okay. Are there any other concerns or observations about the system governance for Central Kansas Library System?
So Tom, did we, in going back to the executive board and the composition and election, did we get clarity on that, on those 2 points? Or I'm feeling like that's still dangling out there.
Yeah, I think I see your point, Steve. Ms. Gail Santee clarified about in terms of the elections, parliamentarians. I guess I don't know if there's any structural problems with it. more so, maybe it's more of a philosophical issue, but you know, when your two largest libraries are feeling like they don't have a say, it's something that needs to be looked into. And that's, you know, that's not really what our subcommittee, I mean, we could get into the weeds of it, but I think we need to, you know, express concerns or not. That was the one that I had personally. Okay. System plan consideration.
Before you continue,
Yeah.
the concerns you just mentioned, are any of them actionable? Meaning, are you making any recommendations to the board as part of your report to do anything in that regard?
Right. I think that, yes, I think that we would need some clarification on that composition of the executive board and elections. And just and perhaps it's a matter of having it explained to us again, but I think there's still a question mark there. And so I'm not sure elucidation of the question or of the plan, maybe. Thanks, Ray. It's not a very specific recommendation, but
Tom, I don't know that we right now could make a specific recommendation that would affect or impact CKLS. What we might want to consider, I'm not suggesting it's necessary today, but you know, we advise all the systems, you know, make sure all of your levels of libraries are adequately represented on the meaningful operational portions of your board.
that's very well stated. I think that's an action, you know, something that the whole State Library of Kansas Advisory Board should look at. Okay, system plan consideration.
And Tom, just go back
Yes,
one
sure.
second.
No problem.
The remote access to meetings, is that something you're comfortable with, just the discussion you had
Yeah.
being it, or do you
Mhm.
want to make a recommendation in that regard?
No, I think that as long as there is an option, whether it's phone or internet, that we don't have a recommendation for change. So that would
Do we state any place, do we state that, you know, we would expect that all systems provide options, virtual options to all libraries or board members. I'm not sure exactly how to phrase that, but I mean, there's an expectation that I know that people can work offline, like, I shouldn't say offline, virtually like this, with the proper preparation by all parties.
Yeah, I think we can make that statement and just a suggestion to all of the systems without having to, you know, have something that requires them all to do that. It's a suggestion. Ray, does that give you enough? Is that enough?
Well, I think if it's a suggestion that's made to the board and the board recommends that, that's one
Yeah.
thing versus actually
Right.
creating a regulation that requires it. And that's up to this committee and the board to make that determination of whether or not to proceed with the latter or the former. But that's up to you guys.
Okay.
I am not advocating, Tom or Ray, that this become a regulatory thing.
Yeah, I don't know that that's necessary, as long as it's, you know, done. And I think going back to our point about making recommendations or requirements for all regional library systems, I think that, while a statement like make sure that everyone has, a say, I think that that's all right, but I don't think we've already, mentioned that we're not really interested in, not that we're not interested, but that we don't recommend all requirements for all systems.
This is like best practices.
Right. It's a good description. This kind of does tie into the first point under D, is lack of a standard format for system plans. They're very different. We all looked at the formats for system plans. And I think it would be good, Rhoda and Steve, especially Steve, being from outside of the library world, you saw the different system plans, and would it be beneficial to have a standard format for all system plans?
Well, there's pluses and minuses, certainly, because all systems are different. I would have loved, when I first started looking at these plans, not being from the library world, it made even less sense to me. But they're starting to make more sense, and the individualization of them seem to make more sense to me. But to the extent that there might be a few points within a plan that could be made and say, this is how we need to see some of these numbers. I love the creativity and the passion that goes into the kind of the discussion of the plan, talking about the vision, talking about where they want to go. It's when it boils down to numbers that it might become advantageous to think about how those numbers get presented in a uniform way, without taking away the individualization of the discussion.
Thanks, Steve. Those are some good points. I think that, and it's not on the agenda, but I think a standardized report to the state library would be appropriate. So all that data is there, it's comparable. So my recommendation, and I'm speaking for myself, but I think that it would be advisable to have a standard report form that regional library systems submit to the state library. And this would be more just like numeric. It's like in January and early February, each library has to fill out a survey to the state library if you want to get a grant. And the systems have surveys, but I think that it would help the state library, and it would help advisory boards if there were a standard report, like in terms of data. Now, Ray, would you speak to that issue? Could you speak to that issue about system reports to the state library?
Well, the systems already report data to the state library that's published on the state library website, so that already exists. The one thing I might throw into this discussion is, you might remember at the June 9th meeting, Ms. Santee mentioned that she would welcome a standardized form for system plans, that she felt her other system directors would welcome that. And that I can tell you, one system director has requested that and mentioned they would be appreciative if there was a standard form. Ms. Santee also mentioned that it would be nice if not using her word, but the jargon, the grants, the allotments, the whatever we call these things were standardized, so we have very clear-cut understanding, and it's easier to view all the plans and understand how they work. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think it has been mentioned multiple times that there is some interest from the systems in developing that. With this agenda item, part of why it was added was to see if there's anything that came up in all of the documentation we reviewed for Hayes about if there's specific aspects of the plan that need to be mentioned because of what you reviewed from what Hayes has discussed, what CKLS has discussed. Does that make sense?
Are you talking about in relation to the format of their plan or the specific?
Well, if there's anything you've learned through reviewing all this documentation that relates to the development of a standard form. Because in the end, the regulation says the state librarian shall provide this form. So in a way, I already have to do it, and we just haven't been doing it.
Right.
But I'm asking, have you learned anything through this committee that you would advise me as I develop a form to take into consideration when I develop that form? Does that make sense? When I hear Steve's comment about the systems are all different, so we'd like to see some of that difference in the plan, and having a standard form might make that a little bit harder to see. Just paraphrasing Steve, so I apologize, that's not fully what you said, but at the same time, it's something that we already, again, are required to do in regulation, we just haven't been doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
I would say, I think an issue that I saw repeated that should be taken into consideration for any type of standardized plan or guidelines or formula would be the discussion of funding based upon resource sharing and what type of resources are shared and how they're shared, because there are some discrepancies or concerns about that. And are the existing criteria of more physical resources still current and relevant with digital resources and sharing?
Thanks, Rhoda. I think there's another thing that should be done in regard to a standardized format, and that is out-of-district borrowers. Number of out-of-district borrowers. What is the ratio of grants to the libraries based on their out-of-district borrowers? That is a significant concern that Hayes raised, is they didn't feel that they were being appropriately compensated for the large amount of out-of-district borrowers that they have. So I think in this terms of standard form, I think what Rhoda says is lending your materials outside of your city or your library, sharing, resource sharing. And then what I just mentioned, out-of-district borrowers, I think those 2 points ought to be in the form, right?
I think mentioning that in the report that you submit to the state library board would be advisable then.
Yeah. Is everyone ready to move on to the next? Okay. Clarification of repercussions if a plan is not approved. And I think, Ray, I think that this is kind of an unknown. What happens if, we tabled it? What happens if it's not approved? And that's probably a question that you would want to, refer to your staff as well as your counsel, Charles, here is what we didn't really know that. Now, from Central Kansas Library System's perspective, not having an approved plan throws off their whole schedule of budget and funding and cycles. I guess I'm not clear what are the repercussions. What happens if the board doesn't approve the plan? It's not clear to me anyway. And I'm
And I
not
think,
sure. Yeah.
I
go
think
ahead.
this committee has already talked about that in a previous meeting, and that's one of the reasons this is on the agenda, is because there needs to be clarification of this, and I'll let Charles chime in if he wishes to.
This is Charles Macheers, the board counsel. The statute is fairly bereft about detail, as you say, Tom. What it does say, I think it kind of indicates the system plan can't be executed or implemented till it is approved. So the board has the authority to amend it so it can be approved.
I'm glad you mentioned amendments, because that's the next point, is clarify repercussions if an amended plan is not implemented. One thing that came up, and I don't recall when, was system funds received from the State Library of Kansas grants. That's perhaps one thing that could be withheld.
Yes, that's correct.
And Ray, it might be advisable to have that. I mean, if that is determined what the board would recommend, that might need to be, well, it would obviously be communicated to all the regional library system directors, but that might need to be actually written into the form.
I think it would need to be a regulation. I don't think. the
Yeah,
form
you're
would be
right.
enough.
Regulation. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess our recommendation would be to have some clarity, and I think depending on what the full system, the full State Library Advisory Board has to say, perhaps withholding of state aid to a system that's not compliant would be one repercussion. I'm not sure what else honestly could be done. I mean, at least by the state library.
I think it's probably adequate enough to say that you want us to consider repercussions and presenting them to the state library board. And from there, it's state library board's decision whether or not to move forward with seeking that regulation. Does that make sense? So way
That
we can
does, yes.
investigate the
So,
other
right,
options.
right, yeah. And then we might mention that as one option. There probably are others. Right. So yeah, we would recommend that it be considered, and probably need, yeah, like you said, administrative regulation. And I think that applies also to the, well, 4 is a little different. It would apply, with if there were non-compliance, there would be a repercussion, but this is basically stating, if a system plan is approved by the state library board and then it's altered, what would repercussions be? That's a little different, and I mean, that's essentially going against the approval. If you significantly now, I mean, things happen, property evaluations could decrease, or something that would, require action from the system, and they do need a lot of, I think they do need some room to adjust their plans based on just economics. But I would think that we could also request that this be lumped in there, like repercussions of altering a plan that has been approved by the state board. And there might need to be, in that there might need to be exceptions, might need to be stated, something along the lines of evaluations not meeting actual income.
Can I say one thing too? If a standardized report is created to give at the state library of the annual budget and all that, if a standardized report at the end is created to be given, it's a section for alterations, and and explanations could be included in that too. Because like you said, sometimes plans change unexpectedly based on out of your control.
Yeah, I think so. And speaking from my experience, we sometimes we need to alter our services. 2020's a perfect example of, things change rapidly with the physical closing down of libraries. So we shifted a lot of money into digital content that wasn't necessarily approved by our board. I updated them on it and so forth, but it was something that a lot of our public libraries did, just as a way to continue serving. So I think, Ray, here our point is just to, recommend that a system plan report perhaps have a narrative section as to if things weren't met or if there were any alterations.
So just to clarify, Tom, I understand if the income, the revenue that's generated through taxes might change, or there might be a change in services because another service comes along that's better. If a system goes and completely changes an aspect of the plan that doesn't relate to either of those, is that an issue?
Oh, yes, certainly.
And when do the repercussions happen? Do they happen after they're reported in the next annual plan as part of this section? Or can the state librarian, the state library board member raise a concern about this to the state library board and seek repercussions at that point if they deem it advisable? Because I think we can, as professionals, can make a determination of what is a legitimate change based on that, those kinds of things, like a new service comes along or revenue didn't meet what it was supposed to do. We can understand that, but I think completely going out and changing a plan aspect that has nothing to do with that is a different beast altogether.
Yeah, I think you're right. Particularly if it involves governance or things along those lines. So yeah, exclusion of, simple, and I think that's something, you're right, that it could be reviewed by, a system director could just, make a statement to the board, hey, this is how we had proposed the plan. This is what we had to do due to new service or due to economics. But you're right, if they change it beyond that, I think that we would advise looking at repercussions.
In which case, should a regulation be generated related to that? It takes all that into consideration.
Steve, you're shaking your head.
I think I was scratching my nose.
Oh, okay. Sorry to call you out like that.
I'm just loath to add regulations if we don't need to. If I was shaking my head, it was because of that.
Yeah, you had stated that earlier.
But there should be some type of system for a grievance or a,
I would certainly agree with that, Rhoda, but we've got boards and overseers throughout all of this whole process, from local libraries through systems through the state. I mean, with some discussion and with some simple notifications, we should be able to deal with most of these things. Because there's a lot of people that look at this, look at and when I say our, I mean our collective operations across the state, from library to library. A lot of people look at this. And so there's certainly, if things need to be called up, they can be called up. If we need to have some standardized approach to how are we going to react to it, that's a whole nother question.
Well, I agree to some extent, but I also think if there's no actual regulation, that might be difficult, for the state library. If there's not, some sort of regulation, if it's not listed specifically. As a state library, I don't think, as an advisory board, I don't want us to be accused of just, withholding monies arbitrarily or something. If there were something written and spelled out, then it would, I think, be more useful to the state library. But yeah, I think we have to be careful not to recommend too many regulations. But I think in regard to state aid to regional systems or whatever, whatever the repercussion is, I think there should be some sort of written. It should be a regulation or administrative, in my opinion, just so that the state library. So as a board, we're looking out for the state library. I think we want to make sure that there would be some way for them to do this That's my opinion. Rhoda and Steve, what, I guess, maybe we don't have a unified voice on this. But
That would be my suggestion, was that the state library review.
do you recommend that they look into a regulation?
I'm sorry, were you asking me that, Tom?
Well, I was asking Rhoda more because you had already spoken to that.
And I don't know that it needs to be set in a regulation of an exact, this is what you follow, but I do think there needs to be some statement of major discrepancies or altering from the plan will be reviewed at the state library level or something along those lines.
Okay, I agree, but we have to make it to where, I mean, where do we write that? Where is that written down if it's not a written regulation? And I see, Charles, you might have some feedback on that.
Yeah, I'm a general counsel for several different boards across the state, and a lot of times controversies or issues arise when there's a lack of clarity on what the rules are. Usually there's a gray area. And so there's also the issues of just checks and balances and accountability. And according to the 1979 Attorney General opinion, that controversy arose because there weren't any regulations delineating how things should be done. And a lot of times the legislature will write very brief statutes, assuming that the subject matter experts in the area will provide detail about how things should run. So usually, and in Kansas, there's very few frivolous regulations. I know there's a mindset that all regulations, or a lot of them, are just red tape or they create problems, and that very well could be at the federal level, but the promulgation process is so rigorous in Kansas. I've really never really found regulations that weren't there for a reason, or to provide clarity or to eliminate conflict. So I think it would be a good idea to consider or recommend maybe some regulations just to provide, because I think one of the reasons this board is meeting is because there's a controversy that arose out of because there was a gray area. So I don't think they should be averse or hesitate to just examine the idea to see if any would be feasible.
Can I add something, Tom, to that? Based on Richard's email, there was a concern about the statutory regulatory authority to do things. And I think by creating a standards maybe in the application or something, that doesn't give us that authority to enforce it. Whereas, as Richard said in his email, they want to know what's the statutory and regulatory authority for things that we're proposing and we're doing. So just saying we want to enforce it as part of an instruction on the application or the standardized form, I don't think it's enough based on what Richard said in his email. I think they need to have a regulation if that is something you want enforced. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. So I suppose, does our committee have a recommendation about potentially looking at authority to make regulation, or to make to have a regulation in general?
See, I will be supportive of that, Tom, that in our report back to the full board, that we see this as perhaps an area that we could be helpful in from a full board to be able to delineate the needs in a regulatory format and the consequences that follow along with that. I think that could be the report. And then that is going to probably necessitate, another subcommittee or something or committee that would be put together to actually get into the nuts and bolts of that.
Yeah, I think it would have to be done by someone on the state end, like looking at the actual do they have authority? And then that's why they have a council and stuff. But I think your point, yeah, I think that our subcommittee can recommend that the state library look into the ability to regulate and spell out repercussions. Does that give? I mean, we'll bring that up to the full board. But yeah, this is where we need to refer to the experts. Certainly. Any other concerns about system plan consideration? Okay. Let's move on to provision of free service. And this is one I think generally that free service has certainly changed quite a bit when the original regulations, Department of Administration rulings were written prior to electronic. I think that Salina Public Library and Central Kansas Library System really did address this in terms of providing requirement to provide digital content to everyone. And maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like that issue was already addressed. Specifically that, so I'm looking at subpoint 2 here. Is that your understanding of it, that the digital resources, limitation of digital resources is acceptable within their system plan? Because I know that was a real significant concern that Hayes and Salina had was, hey, if we're providing a service like Hoopla, it's going to just drain our coffers. And we need to, limit it to the people that are paying tax revenue for that service, right? Did my understanding right that the MOU kind of already addressed that?
Tom, can I chime in from a different perspective to that?
Please,
I think in Richard's email, he implied there was some agreement between the system directors about whether digital resources should be part of provision of free service. However, in a lot of the documentation that we have for this committee, such as Ms. Santee's January 17th letter, when she was talking with Salina about this issue, there was a question about, they said basically at this time, CKLS is waiting to seek an attorney general's opinion on how this regulation might be interpreted, specifically relating to pay-per-use services such as Hoopla. This wasn't the only correspondence. I believe there's also a September 15th letter that raised this idea that it's not clear with the provision of free service whether digital resources were applicable, whether they had to be provided to everyone. So it seems like based on those two letters, there was some desire for the Attorney General's office to get involved. Whereas the provision of free service, the statute that it's based on, is within the authority of the State Library Board. So it's not inappropriate to ask the Attorney General for an opinion. But if this was an issue that needed to be addressed, as was mentioned in the September 15th and the January 17th letter from CKLS and that discussion between CKLS and Salina, it would also be in the purview of the board to address this and to seek a change to the regulation that was initially created, I believe, by the board itself. Does that make sense?
yes. Yes, I do recall CKLS wanting an attorney general's opinion about digital resources. I think this is a massive shift. Provision of free service. And what is free service? What can be limited? Some of our libraries participate in overdrive consortiums, which are limited to people that have library cards. Andover, the original contract we had with overdrive stipulated that they had to reside in a certain zip code. We asked them to strike that, and they did. But there are some things that might not be available or for everyone. And when we talk about the logistics of Hoopla, I don't see a scenario where it's appropriate to ask a library to pay for Hoopla for outside users. It's just such an expensive model. I think that this is a big point and probably needs. I think maybe it would be useful to discuss what is free service first, like, and maybe that's a committee, or maybe that's, a discussion somewhere. I think it probably would benefit the state library to have that to give to the Attorney General, if that's something that we think they should do. Is here's explaining the situation, because it's going to require some explanation. But I think at some point it will need to be considered, and we probably do need an administrative regulation. I think specifically in regard to Central Kansas Library System, it looked to me like the MOUs, or that the understanding that Salina Public Library came came with the Central Kansas Library System, is that they actually settled that matter. Am I misreading that?
You want me to respond to that, Tom? I'm not.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Yeah, sure. I know.
I believe they've resolved that specific issue. I believe that issue has come up in different ways in what Hayes has asked this committee to look at. Because they've had concerns about their Hoopla. They've had concerns about providing digital access to other products to a much larger footprint than what their city limits are, essentially.
Yeah, sure.
And I think the fact that CKLS and Salina realized there was a need for some clarification is further indication that there probably is. It's a question of whether they suggested we go to the Attorney General, or we as a library community make those changes ourselves, given the state library board's authority to regulate on this matter and to change the regulation that is already on the books.
So Tom, this is Steve. I would say that based on this discussion, our recommendation to the board, to the state board, is that we need to dig into this one more thoroughly and clarify wherever possible.
Okay. I have a comment. I'm leery of involving State Attorney General's office in this. It'd be nice if the library communities could come to a working resolution. Secondly, I would hope that the agreement and understanding that Central Kansas Library System has with Salina could be applied to Hayes as well. I would hope it would address their concerns in regard to digital resources. But you're right. I think you're right, Steve. I think we need to recommend that this be studied further, with a preference to keep it within, I think, the state library advisory board.
I would certainly agree with that.
I might add, I think Richard gives us a starting point based on his email saying that there already is some agreement on this topic with the systems, and maybe that's a starting point for that change in the regulation.
Yes, you're right. That's a good point. Yeah, I was rereading Richard's email prior to our meeting, and I was I'd made that notation too, that, you know, they're already trying to address that. And so, but I think we do need to kick this to the whole committee or to the whole board, and, you know, there needs to be a discussion. And sounds like the regionals are already doing that. And maybe the state library doesn't need to be involved. But we're talking about it now because Hayes Public Library had concerns about it. And I think that addresses the subsequent points in regards to requirements for the digital resources and so forth. For now. Rhoda, Steve, is there anything that our committee should state to the full board or the
I
state?
think it's just that, Tom, that we need to clarify and understand and learn from the systems and set out some ground rules that we all can work with.
And one thing that there is to consider is the State Library of Kansas is providing statewide free electronic resources. It's one of the, you know, the wonderful services that the state library offers. And, you know, other digital resources could be seen as just additions to local content, perhaps. Does that give, Ray, does that give enough direction, you think, for us to, you know, kind of push that along with a few recommendations?
Yeah, I think that's adequate to keep the process moving forward.
Okay, Steve, Rhoda, is there anything else that we need to address? Think back on the specific complaints of or issues that, pardon me, that Hayes brought forward.
One other question I have, can we clarify the timeline of the funding allotment for 2024 versus 2025? Because I feel like there was still, like, we maybe thought based on the 3-year plan. I just want to make sure. So can someone say that directly to me if that's clear?
Well, no, in the sense it's not, because we recommended not doing an MOU. I mean, Central Kansas Library System has their preference to do that. And they, you know, perhaps that should be eliminated prior to the next full system board.
My question was, so the plan that we approved would take place when? That's what my question was.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's the 2024 plan.
Rhoda might add that there were multiple times during that last meeting we asked about when the allotments and when the formulas would take effect. So there is discussion on record in the recording that's available for further clarification.
Anything else?
Can I ask a question, Tom?
Please.
Was there anything in the letter that was sent on behalf of Hayes Public Library on Friday that was forwarded to you that you wish to address specifically?
I'm glad you asked that. Okay, specifically, Well, in terms of allotments and things, Hayes has described it as inequitable approach to distribution of tax funds. So from their perspective, it's not fair. And I think we approved the 2024, or we amended the 2024 CKLS system plan, and they have it. But certainly prior to the next 2025 plan, I think it needs to be clear as to how they're funding things. We already addressed the MOU. That was a concern that Hayes had, and I believe we addressed that. Those were. Oh, there's one other thing that Hayes, the letter from the attorney Hayes Public Library Board mentioned that I think we can address now, and that was regard to capital outlay funds. In the letter, it references a July 12th Central Kansas Library System Executive Committee that CKLS was considering taking money out of the capital outlay fund to process those grants. And Hayes wasn't sure about capital outlay funds and if it's a regular practice. And yes, it is. Just like public libraries have capital improvement fund, regional library systems have a similar thing where they are allowed to carry over monies to be used, and there are I believe stipulations as to where and what it can be used for. I could speak to public libraries, and I'm not sure if there's a distinction between the regionals, but there are regulations, at least for public libraries, regarding what we can carry over. And I don't recall if the capital outlay, the capital fund of Central Kansas Library System was in their plan or not. I can look real fast. But that is a concern that the Hayes brought forward. I think. Oh, I have a hand raised by Gail. Gail, you take a minute to explain the capital outlay.
I'd be glad to, Tom. That is not addressed in the system plan. That is reported on in the annual report to include our carryover as well, and that goes to the state library and then is published. That's it.
All right, great, thanks. So yeah, that wouldn't have shown up in their system plan. And certainly regional library systems need to have fund for their capital improvements. They're not, they have, some of them rent facilities, but some of them own facilities, and there are capital expenses. So I think that can address some of the concern Hayes had is, do they even have this fund? So yes, and they're allowed to. I'm not sure about spending it on processing or not. And it's possible that the central is moving some of their capital funds to pay for other expenses in their system plan. And then you can move money around. I don't know. Do we need a further response on this concern of Hayes? It might be good to have capital expenditures as part of a report, right? That the systems make. And I'm not sure what exactly the report is that they do for the annual report, but and Gail mentioned that it already is in there. So it might just be a matter of awareness of this by system members. Rhoda or Steve, do you think we need to address this further?
I don't think we need to address the capital question further. It just needs to be explained clearly and offered that up as a response. I do have one other thing, though, I want to raise.
Please.
In the letter, the June 26th letter from the Jeter firm, the last paragraph where the attorney was summing up, HPL believes this is an effective short-term resolution. That is the amended plan that we put forth. However, they are not amenable or agreeing to or being perceived to having agreed to any sort of a funding formula in future years that doesn't address their underlying concerns about equity in future systems. So I don't know how we move on effectively without putting some sort of process in place that can drive down into their concerns and specifics more than that paragraph that was written.
Yeah,
They're not in the boat.
yeah, and well, we've already stated that we don't recommend an MOU, and that, you know, probably an MOU won't have any teeth to it. So, you know, I think it'd be very beneficial if this could be some sort of agreement could be made between Hayes Public Library and Central Kansas Library System to where this doesn't come up every year to the state board. You know,
I'd certainly agree. We've got two parties here who won't even talk to one another, presumably, without their attorneys. And that's no way to run an organization like this, I don't think. So we've got to figure out how we can encourage that discussion and getting down to brass tacks about how it can be resolved.
we had previously talked about mediation, and in terms of, you know, Charles pointed out that we don't really have the ability to like put teeth behind the mediation. Charles, I don't want to speak for you.
I'm not suggesting any particular tactic, and that's just one, mediation. I'm suggesting that this ain't over.
Yeah,
So
clearly it's
I
not,
think we
yeah.
need to be responsive to that
Right.
and create some conditions where it can get over, but it's not going to get over if it's not addressed.
Can I point out of the first discussion point again that we kind of moved on from and did not make any recommendations for, which was the structure of the CKLS plan allotments. That was an opportunity for concerns about the way the allotments and the formulas were structured to be brought up. At that time, you guys didn't raise any concerns.
Right.
Is that misreading your decision to move on from that topic, that you think there needs to be further discussion of that? Or
No,
a
I
little
think
confused about that.
I think that we're talking about the 2024 allotments. Hayes is concerned that Central Kansas is going to scale that back and fully eliminate it. And that's different from, you know, an annual plan, annual approval. When we look at the 2024 plan, we can say, okay, we kind of came out of compromise. But as Steve said, it's not over. I think we could recommend that a third party, you know, I mean, I guess we're the third party, but I don't want the board to have to go through this again next June.
Yeah, this is Charles. I guess the only thing I would say is really the board is the mediator, and the board is the authority that resolves those issues between the different libraries.
And perhaps our committee ought to recommend providing mediation or
I think previously Charles mentioned it might be inappropriate to have a mediator between these two public entities. I'm sorry.
That's right. Yes, that's what I was referring to. Yeah.
Charles.
Yeah, I mean, really, the board is the mediator. The board resolves the issue. So hopefully they can resolve it between themselves, but if not, the board will help them resolve the issue.
So I think our subcommittee could make a recommendation to the full board to begin the process of mediation.
I don't like that word mediation.
Okay,
It
what's a better word?
It infers another third party. And to Charles' point, we're it. So I just didn't want to move forward without recognizing that at least one of these parties that are in this dispute has already stated they're not going to be happy. And I mean, I just think reading that paragraph to me, that's what it, plain language says. So I think we just have to figure out how to get to the bottom of that. And it's apparently our responsibility to help them do that. Did I say that right, Charles?
Yeah, I think so. I think with the amended system plan, that hopefully rectifies it for this year, and the board just approved system plans for each individual year. And I think as we work through some regulation revisions, or maybe a couple new regulations, that'll eliminate the ambiguities and everything will be clear going forward. And hopefully that will, when we come back here next year, hopefully there won't be any issues. At least that's our hope.
I got it.
Okay. There is one more issue in that final paragraph. And that Hayes has raised, and that is the withdrawal of taxing district. So now if a community, township, county wants to withdraw from a regional library system, they can do so, and that is approved by the state board. It has to be approved by the state board. However, there's a 2-year period where systems still receive their system tax from that area. It's, I think, designed to, prevent manifest harm. The attorney mentions House Bill 2176, which was, I think, correctly, like they're saying, an attempt to avoid that regulation. Is that something that is that 2-year dual taxation something that hasn't really, I don't know that has sort of, it has come up, but not, it's very spelled out in this final letter. That would be, there's actually that KAR 54-117. It spells out that there is a, it spells that out. Hayes is asking for reconsideration of that. Revising the regulatory requirements to withdraw from. And this did come up, like it references the House bill. It did come up. And Ray, you provided a written testimony to the State House of Representatives, as did Paul Hawkins, director of South Central Kansas Library System.
I think these are two very different issues. One is a special district being created under the House bill, and one is, well, in theory, we don't know what this withdrawal would be. At the time, there's the Hayes Public Library and its taxing district, which already has been withdrawn from the taxing base, as Brandon mentioned, or as the attorney for CKLS mentioned. Sorry, I'm losing my own. The attorney for Hayes mentioned in the letter we are referencing. I just think they're two different issues. I think there's an interesting point of they can move forward and be taxed for 2 years and still not know if the state library board is going to approve them leaving the taxing district, which seems a little odd. So maybe there's an opportunity to say there is a 2-year waiting period, but that the approval is done at the front end, and then there's 2 years afterwards that they're still being taxed in both places. Does
Ray,
that
I
make
thought,
sense?
I believe that's how we did it several years ago. There was a small library in southeast Kansas, a small town that dissolved their library. Or there was a vote to dissolve the library and return that funding to the regional library. I think you're right, it should be done in advance, like the board approves the withdrawal. And then they have 2 years after the approval. And if that's not spelled out specifically, I think it should be.
I think it's the other way. It's the other way
It's the
around.
other way
Where
around.
it's done after the fact.
Hmm,
After the 2 years is when they can
Okay.
petition the state library board. It might be worth considering having that upfront, that decision made, and then having 2 years to make sure the system has time to wait for that in their system plan and budget. But also to make sure that the taxing district, the local taxing district, actually does tax at the level they're taxing of the 0.25 mil or higher. And this is certainly something we need to have further consideration and discussion about, because there's implications we might not be discussing right now, but
yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, it has implications for each regional library system. And I think we should. I like the proposed change of approval first, then 2 years.
is that a recommendation that this committee agrees on?
That's mine. Steve, Rhoda, I don't want to speak for you.
This is Charles. I think KAR 54-1-12 sets out the procedure. I might answer your question. The library petitions the State Library Advisory Commission for withdrawal.
One benefit of having it 2 years after is the State Library of Kansas board can determine, did they provide the 2-year period? Because if they didn't, then you would vote no on the withdrawal. So there are merits to having it at the end.
But there could be a mention in the regulation that it's dependent on them collecting the mill levy of 0.25 or mil or more for the 2 years and beyond that. Otherwise, they go back into the system. Does that make sense?
It does. I think we could recommend that some clarity be sought on that.
And I guess I would recommend it's KR 54, 117, and 21 that I probably would be looking at on that. Particularly 17, but 21 references 17.
Steve, Rhoda, is that something that you would like this, you think the state library should do, is investigate that and potential changes? Because if we don't think they should, then, but I think we're talking about action items here.
Without knowing all the implications, I'm hesitant to answer on that, to be honest.
Steve, you're muted.
I don't think I know enough one way or another. And I don't think I can give a good response to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason, Ray, that you couldn't bring that up as an item in the next State Library Advisory Board committee. We don't have to necessarily endorse it. We can take no action on this particular concern. I think maybe our action item would be clarification. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe we just leave it. And if that's something that the board or state library wants to bring up in the future, they can.
I'd say clarification is the right word, Tom.
Okay. All right. So there's the action item. Are there any other topics that we need to address? Okay, let's talk about next steps so it's clear. I know Ray and Wolf, I think you were jotting those down. Probably be good to reiterate those at this point so everyone in the meeting can hear that. Did either of you, Wolf or Ray, did either of you have a specific, did you mark specific action items? I admit I did not write them down as we were going.
I can go through some of the things that I noted as potentially important. And you all can identify whether that is what you're calling an action item. Would you like me to go back to the beginning or start from here and go up?
I guess alternatively, we have a recording of this meeting and
Yeah,
can
that's a good
make the
point,
list
yeah.
and send it to you as well as the recording of the meeting. So that way, make sure everyone on the committee is in agreement with what we write up based on the recording. And go that way rather than.
Yeah, then do it now.
I made some really brief notes about specific things, but I didn't make
Okay.
a comprehensive list, to be honest.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think we'll do that then. Are there next steps? I mean, that's the next step for our committee is to review that list. Is there anything else that our committee ought to be looking into prior to our September meeting with the full State Library of Kansas Advisory Board? And maybe that's a question that we answer after we get those notes in the action plan.
Yeah, I would say if we get the notes from this meeting, actions from this meeting, that will tell us if we need to have another clarifying meeting amongst us or not.
Great. Before we adjourn, is it possible to attach the email that Richard Brookman sent regarding system concerns to these? I know our packet didn't have it in there. I think it was the Friday afternoon
It
email.
was sent on Saturday morning.
Saturday morning,
It was
okay, yeah.
posted, I think Thursday or Wednesday.
Yeah.
I think pending the motion by this committee to add it to the minutes is fine, and we can then do that. I don't have an objection to it.
I so move that Richard's letter of July 15th be added to the minutes of this meeting.
Seconded.
Oh, so it shall. It'll be added to the documents and minutes. Thank you everyone for your time. We'll be looking forward to the emails and we will move on from there. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Meeting adjourned.